Hello, I'm Diana Reich, the Artistic Director of the Charleston Literary Festival based in South Carolina, USA. I would like to welcome you from wherever in the world that you may be watching. If the past fraught 18 months has taught us anything, it has taught us that books and their authors, whether classical or contemporary, really matter. In trying times, readers turn to books for insights into the human condition, for the opportunity to be transported to other worlds, for ideas, for arguments, for inspiration, for experiencing the impossible, for laughter, and for the release of tears. The festival will provide the opportunity to engage with a galaxy of literary and artistic stars, as well as up-and-coming writers who are making waves. We have a far-flung cast list featuring authors from all over the United States, as well as the United Kingdom and elsewhere. Whether they're talking about former literary trailblazers, or gene editing, or human rights, or popular culture, or feminism, or medieval nuns, or innumerable other subjects, they have one thing in common: the ability of compelling stories to linger in our imaginations. We're grateful to all our speakers, whether virtual or in person, for sharing their talents. Please thank them by purchasing their books. The festival couldn't happen without a committed team and board. We would like to thank our donors, both private and public, who generously make the festival possible. The College of Charleston, our academic partner, has been an invaluable source of support. It's no accident that the festival takes place in Charleston, a prime destination with a progressive literary and artistic tradition. Please come and see for yourselves, but make sure to visit during the Charleston Literary Festival, which takes place during the first half of November each year. Meanwhile, I hope that you enjoy the 2021 Charleston Literary Festival and that it makes you think and dream afresh.
Good afternoon and welcome to this first session of the Charleston Literary Festival, Books, Ideas, and Conversations. I am Suzanne Austin, Executive Vice President of Academic Affairs and Provost at the College of Charleston, located in the historic heart of Charleston, South Carolina. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our guest this afternoon. Walter Isaacson is a New York Times bestselling author and a professor of history at Tulane University. Mr. Isaacson has served as president and CEO of the Aspen Institute, chair and CEO of CNN, and editor of Time. He is the author of biographies of Leonardo da Vinci, Steve Jobs, Albert Einstein, Benjamin Franklin, and Henry Kissinger. Welcome, Walter.
Thanks. It's good to be back in Charleston, at least virtually, and I look forward to being back next year in real.
Wonderful. So your new book, Codebreaker, is your first that features a woman as your central character. Tell us about Jennifer Doudna and the science behind CRISPR.
You know, the books I've written have been about people who are very creative, caused revolutions, whether it be the physics revolution in the first half of the 20th century with Albert Einstein, or the digital revolution with Steve Jobs and the other innovators like Ada Lovelace that defined the time that you and I grew up in, the second half of the 20th century. We're now entering a life sciences revolution in which molecules are going to be the new microchip. We're going to be able to reprogram to do things. You know, we're going to use RNA to reprogram them to make spike proteins. So we have vaccines against the coronavirus. Or, as Jennifer Doudna discovered and won the Nobel Prize for, we're going to be able to use them to edit our own DNA. For the first time in 3 billion years, there's a species on this planet that can hack its own evolution, can decide how to design its children or to fix genetic diseases, and that will be us. So this book is about Jennifer Doudna, who was the one, along with Emmanuel Charpentier, her research partner, to discover how do you create this tool that will edit human DNA. And it becomes not just a scientific thriller as they chase it, but also a moral and political story about when should we use it? Who should get to decide how we're going to edit the human species?
So you actually were trained to do RNA editing yourself. And the book does a wonderful job walking us through the science of CRISPR. You want to tell us a little bit about your experience working in the lab and working with these young scientists, and your own path of discovery of this amazing and very complicated science?
Well, I'm not sure the complications are that bad, because this is something bacteria have been doing for 3 billion years in order to fight viruses. And bacteria aren't that much smarter than we are. And so once I learned how bacteria did it, which is they simply take a mugshot of any virus that attacks, a little bit of the genetic code, and they put them in these clustered repeated sequences known as CRISPRs that are in their own genetic code. Well, that seemed simple enough. And so I went to the lab at Berkeley, and in a couple of days, I was trained on how to use that as a tool to edit human genes. So I just pretty easily, and I say easily because I had 2 graduate students helping me in a very good lab, was able to edit a human kidney gene in a test tube so that it would have a little phosphor in it. It would glow in the dark. Don't worry, we flushed it down the drain, poured chlorine down. It's not part of the human species now. But I wanted to show, and I hope the book shows, we're not talking about quantum mechanics here. We're not talking about the most complicated thing in the world. We're talking about something that bacteria have been doing, and we have now made into a tool that'll help us edit our own DNA.
And part of the book talks about the fact that this science is relatively easily accessible, it's replicable, and there are individuals out there in the world who are carrying out their own scientific experiments and working on genetic editing. And some of these folks are not affiliated with institutions. I mean, they're sort of lone rangers out there. And I know you talk in the book some about the implications of having some of these folks out there doing this work.
Yeah, there are biohackers out there. One of them is a character in my book named Josiah Zahner. And in his garage, he's using CRISPR to do edits, and he'll even sell it online. So you can have a do-it-yourself CRISPR kit. However, let me emphasize, this is not something you can easily do in order to edit a child or whatever. That takes fertility clinics and planting, embryos into the womb. So this is a technology that will be able to keep under control to a large extent. There will be biohackers and rogue scientists in different countries who may try to do things, but I do think that at least for the next 20 or 30 years, we have a chance of figuring out, when do we want to use this? What are the moral reasons to use it? And then how do we control it? Just like the FDA controls drugs that people could make in their basement if they wanted to, we have a way, both as a society here in the US, but also globally, to think through this issue and say, what do we really want to do? When do we want to use it? And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I think it's useful for people to have some understanding of this. The science is not complicated at all, but the moral implications are. And that's why we shouldn't just delegate to the scientists, when do you want to use it? We should all be part of this conversation of saying, should we allow rich people, for example, to make their kids a few inches taller, or to enhance their IQ, or to change their hair color or skin color or sexual orientation, various things that 30, 40 years from now we'll be able to do. It's useful to start the moral conversation now.
Right. And you talk in the book also about the history of genetic hygiene in the world. Do you want to talk a little bit about that as a way to sort of set the stage for this more contemporary conversation that the book engages us in?
I think that throughout the 20th century, we've seen what we could call eugenics, which is people trying to create good genes. Now, the eugenics movement happens in Cold Spring Harbor, New York. It happens, throughout the early 20th century, where we're trying to say what traits are inherited and how do we, I guess you could say, breed better humans to make sure we have the right inherited traits. Of course, eugenics, especially state-sponsored eugenics, became something that was abhorrent when the Nazis started engaging in eugenics. And I think it was a wake-up call that we want to be very careful about how far we go down that road. In my book, I talk about the fact that I don't think there'll ever be a state-sponsored genetic programs where the state is ordering or telling or trying to create the master race or whatever it may be. But I do think that we have to worry about what I would call a free market eugenics. If gene editing tools become widely available, what's to stop people from deciding that they want to design their own children? And when they do so, you could have two very serious consequences. One is the rich will be able to buy better genes for their children than the disadvantaged or other people will. And that'll not only exacerbate the divide we already have in society, but it would encode it into our genes. You'd have a subspecies that's genetically enhanced, like in Brave New World or the movie Gattaca. And the other thing would be if we start breeding out and editing out the diversity of our species. Parents might say, I want to edit out the gene for deafness. Well, I could understand that. And they may want to edit out the genes for obesity. They may have preferences for, sexual orientation. After a while, when you start doing all of those edits, are we going to edit out the diversity in our species, the diversity that makes our species so creative, but also biologically so resilient?
So I want to come back to that in a minute, but I also want to talk about one of the themes that emerges very clearly in Codebreaker, and that is around competition, the often very fierce competition between scientists and between their institutions. I mean, you have a faculty position at Tulane. I'm here at the college. I've been at other research institutions. So what role does competition play in science in general and in genetic editing specifically?
Well, I think competition plays a role in all of our lives, whether we're our kids are in little league sports, or we're in business, or we're in journalism. We're all trying to get scoops or win the games. And I think it's a good thing. It spurs us on. But in science in particular, you have a wonderful combination of collaboration and competition, where people are aiming for something higher. They're not, they're driven competitively to get there first. They want priority. They want publication. They want Nobel Prizes. They want the patents that come from it. But also they're aiming to do something higher, which is discover how nature works and then turn that into something that can be useful for the human species, such as a mRNA vaccine, for example. And so this mix of competition and collaboration is what I think distinguishes research science. In my book, it sometimes gets out of balance. As much as I love Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier, they're in a very competitive race through part of the book against the guys at MIT and Harvard, led by Feng Zhang and Eric Lander and others. And they want to win the race to figure out how to edit human genes using CRISPR. And they want the patents, and they're still in a patent battle for it. One of the good things that came out of COVID is all of those labs then turned their discoveries to see how it could help in the fight against COVID. And in doing so, instead of doing it in a very competitive way, every time they got new discoveries, they were putting it on open servers so that everybody could use it. They were not asserting intellectual property rights over them, because I think COVID reminded us of the higher purpose of why we do research and why we do science.
And I think that's a really important point, because you're right that during the pandemic, scientists at institutions around the world were just openly sharing all of this information. So do you think that that can continue? Do you think it will continue, maybe in certain areas and not in others? I mean, that is, and you did a really good job in the book, I think, talking about when the university attorneys get involved in all of the patent discussions and intellectual property. I mean, that competition is very, very fierce between institutions. And then the pandemic comes along, all of a sudden everything's opened up wide. And part of me thinks it's probably going to close back down again, but I don't know what your thoughts are.
Well, you're an academic provost. I don't know how many lawyers you have at your place. I know at Tulane we're creating a bioinnovation zone. And at Tulane, we want to make sure we commercialize the discoveries as well. And some people look down upon that. I remember when I was in college many, many years ago, commercializing discoveries was considered something a bit, one should not do that. Right. But I think Stanford led the way in the 1970s, whether it was Hewlett and Packard or Genentech and others that come out of Stanford research discoveries, and they start the digital revolution in what becomes Silicon Valley. And so I think universities across the United States then said, okay, we have to find ways to commercialize our discoveries better. Some people feel that that's problematic. I'm actually somebody who believes in the market. I believe that it's a good idea for people to take what they discover at the bench and try to bring it to the bedside, meaning try to bring it to the patient. And that requires intellectual property, patents, research and development funding. And so I think we've got a pretty good system. To get specifically to your question of whether we will revert back to being purely competitive, as I say in the book, I think this was a bit of a wake-up call, especially for the young scientists involved, to remember that even though patents and intellectual property and commercialization is a useful thing, it's not the main thing. The main thing is, what can you do to help the human species and to help this planet? And I think this reminder that we're all on a fragile planet together will help keep in balance this notion of research for profitability's sake versus research for the sake of the planet.
Right, and I certainly hope that's true. The other thing that I think one of the other things that I think is very interesting in the book is that a lot of these innovations are coming out of basic science. Mm-hmm. And the funding, the federal funding, excuse me, for basic bench science has ebbed and flowed in this country over time. And you and I both know that there are other nations that are funneling much more significant amounts of support into basic science in other parts of the world. So do you think that the pandemic has been a wake-up call in this country, and that there will be perhaps increased funding for basic science in the United States?
Well, I sure hope so. I mean, it was basic science research for no particular known purpose, but just curiosity-driven research that caused people to figure out what messenger RNA was. This was something, it was begun in the 1970s and 80s. Crick and Watson, who did the original DNA, were there figuring out RNA and its role. But then at the University of Pennsylvania, you have Kati Karichka, she's a wonderful scientist who figured out how you could harness messenger RNA and get it into cells. All of that research was done out of just basic curiosity about the beauty of nature. But like a lot of discoveries about basic curiosity of nature, they then lead eventually to something useful. Over and over again, we see this happen. CRISPR was just driven out of basic curiosity about, why do these bacteria have clustered repeated sequences? It makes no sense. They don't have that much DNA. Why are they wasting it on these CRISPR sequences? And then eventually people who make yogurt were realizing that their bacteria cultures had been attacked by viruses, but the way to protect them was these CRISPR sequences helped protect them. And so people took this basic discovery and did something useful, which is make yogurt better and make cheese better. That then, of course, leads to gene editing, and it leads to fighting COVID. So we have to keep in mind, as Vannevar Bush said in 1946, when he creates government funding for basic science, he says basic science discoveries will be the seed corn from which future innovations and inventions drive our economy. And I'm pretty optimistic. I know that Joe Biden, who I've spent time discussing this with, believes in kicking up both health funding, science funding, cancer funding, basic research funding. He's got Eric Lander, one of Jennifer Doudna's competitors in the CRISPR race, there as his scientific advisor. So, and I think people in Congress sometimes used to make fun of doing basic science research on, bacteria repeated sequences. Well, now you ask, why did you make fun of that? You see what it's led to?
Exactly. And I think that's one of the really important contributions of your book is to give people examples of how basic science can do exactly that. And no one knew that this pandemic was going to come along, and no one knew the role that RNA was going to play in a lot of these different biomedical advances that we've had. So I was just very excited.
Well, thank you for saying that, because that one purpose of the book, as I said earlier in this conversation, was to make sure we could all be engaged in the discussion about how we use gene editing. But the other purpose of the book was to push this notion that basic science can be useful. And then there's a third little point I want to make, which is basic science can be useful, but also basic science is beautiful in and of itself. Nature is beautiful, not just useful, it's beautiful because it's a miracle of all sorts of phenomenon. And so I think we should all love basic science, both for its beauty and also for its usefulness.
I agree. I mean, as we tell children, science can be fun. And I'm wondering too, if you're starting to see or have people come up to you when you're out and about and talk about the fact that their children are more interested in biology or they're more interested in chemistry. Because, in this country, we don't always have as many young people who are interested in studying basic science as is the case in other parts of the world. So I'm hoping that perhaps the pandemic and some of these really exciting biomedical innovations can also stimulate more interest among young people in this country. Have you seen any of that?
It's totally already happening. I mean, the applications to medical school in the past year and a half, up 40%. At Tulane, the number of students doing pre-med has shot up. It used to be in the 70s and 80s, you wanted to learn coding. Digital coding was a big thing. Now it's not the coding of 0101 binary code. It's the ATCG of genetic coding people are going to want to do. And so we're just seeing it at Tulane alone, a massive shift in the undergraduate studies of people wanting to go into the life sciences because it's going to be a life sciences centric. And when Jennifer Doudna, my hero, was just in middle school, she picked up James Watson's book, The Double Helix, which is about the discovery of the structure of DNA. And she hadn't wanted to be a scientist. She wanted to study French. She said she wanted to write French poetry. She was growing up in Hawaii. Who knew? But she reads the book and a couple things happen. She realizes that nature has these wonderful mysteries, these wonderful secrets that you can discover and then understand how life works. And secondly, she notices there's a woman in the book, Rosalind Franklin, who's treated dismissively by James Watson, but it causes Jennifer to think, wait a minute, girls can be scientists? I never knew that. So when her dad put that book on her bed, it changed her life. I'm hoping not only the COVID epidemic, but maybe some other people will put my book or books like it, Carl Zimmer, I know he's speaking with y'all too, his book on people's beds, and maybe it'll make their kids, their daughters or their sons say, hey, I want to be interested in science and the life sciences.
So tell us a little bit about the controversy surrounding the awarding of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry last year to Doudna and Charpentier. Why was there some controversy around that?
Well, it wasn't controversial to me. I cheered the minute I heard it. I got up at 4 a.m. so I could hear the live stream from Stockholm. Usually they give it, first of all, I was surprised because it's usually something that happened a long time ago. They wait a while. In fact, the day before Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier won it in biology, Sir Roger Penrose won the prize in physics for a discovery he had made about black holes 50 years ago. So I thought it is not yet time to give it to the people who did CRISPR. But I also thought that they would probably split the prize, especially given the patent battle, and the prize would be given maybe to Doudna and Charpentier, but also Feng Zhang or George Church or somebody who was part of the MIT Harvard competition. But the Academy decided to give it only to two people. They usually give it to three, and to make it Doudna and Charpentier, which, I don't know if it was controversial, but it was helpful to the book. It gave me a good last chapter.
That's great. So one of the scientists in the book talks about the democratization of medicine that is emerging from many of the latest biomedical breakthroughs. With the widespread access to the internet and what you might call the democratization of information, we know that has led to some very complicated consequences, some good and some not so good. So first, do you agree with this statement about the democratization of medicine? And if so, what do you foresee as some of the consequences, both good and bad, that may emerge from this?
I believe very strongly in the democratization of science. It should not be left to a priesthood of people only, who are part of the academy, as much as you and I like being at universities, because I think we're all going to have to be involved in the dilemmas and the moral questions around science. And so if we meaning people who are not scientists, people like myself, remain unfamiliar with science, then we're not going to be able to be part of the conversation. Secondly, I think that it's important as to be a citizen of this world, to be somewhat involved in our own ways in science, to try to keep up with it. But in my case, last year and a half ago, before the vaccines came out, I just went online and looked at vaccine trials, and I became part of a clinical trial. We all read about those clinical trials, but I think if you actually sign up, and I went to Ochsner hospital here in New Orleans, and they were doing clinical trials, but every hospital, I'm sure in Charleston, there's many of them going on. I think it's useful for all of us to be somewhat involved in science, just as we would be in rooting for our sports teams or voting for our candidates.
So with the increased availability of at-home testing for various types of diseases and genetic conditions, what do you think? I mean, I find some of that a little unsettling because you could get one of these genetic tests, for example, and find out some maybe disturbing information. And if you're not already part of a network of support so that people can help you interpret what the information that you've received and maybe what the implications of that are, I think it could be, one, very scary for people, but it also might lead people to make some decisions that aren't particularly well informed. So have you thought much about how we as a society should be wrestling with, on the one hand, it's great, you can do these things at home, but on the other hand, it's a lot more complicated sometimes than people think it's going to be.
Look, I think we should all learn about the basics of everything from genetics to health to medicine and have more control. We're not dumb people. We can try to figure this out. And I think that, in the when I was growing up, suddenly the computer came up in 1974, 75. I can almost remember it exactly when they had the first personal computers. You could actually put, and then people started building applications on it. They built things that were very harmful, such as Facebook, and they built things that were very useful, such as Wikipedia. And I think that we all have to realize these technologies are coming into our homes. We're soon going to have home testing kits for a variety of things. We're going to be able to test quickly to say, do I have COVID? Does my kid have flu, strep throat? Has my cancer tumor recurred? Am I genetically prone to Alzheimer's? All of these things we're going to know. So it's useful to have some context. And that's maybe a fifth reason I wrote this book, is so that people can have a context for what we can and will be able to learn and how to put it in the context of biology.
So can you catch us up on some of the latest developments in gene editing or CRISPR since you finished the manuscript? It's been a little while.
Yeah, well, just as I was finishing, and there's a wonderful picture of her in the book, Victoria Gray became the first person, a Mississippi woman who has sickle cell, to have her blood stem cells edited using CRISPR. So she has been cured of sickle cell. So that was the first time in human history that we've edited the genes of a real human being to fix a disease. Since then, we've done, and that was only about a year ago, in the past year, we've certainly done a lot with blood diseases, congenital blindness, other things. I think now we're looking at using CRISPR in ways that, has already been done, like a Chinese scientist did it, but might make our cells lack the receptors for certain viruses. After the COVID epidemic, people saying, well, that's a bad idea. We don't want to mess with Mother Nature. Well, Mother Nature's been messing with us for the past year and a half. So I can see these things happening. The other great advances in the past year deal with cancer immunotherapy, because immunotherapy is often defeated by the wiliness of cancer cells that know how to turn off, certain aspects of an immunotherapy. But with CRISPR, we can win the battle against cancer, especially in this personalized immunotherapies that are being created.
It was really interesting to be introduced to this fairly large cast of characters, all of these scientists at many different institutions from different countries all around the world. So now that you're plugged into this network and being at Tulane, which is a big research institution, what do you think young scientists are working on now? I mean, what comes after CRISPR?
Yeah, I think that when I was growing up and first writing about Steve Jobs and the innovators, I would go to a lot of tech conferences. I'd go to the original Comdex and the West Coast Computer Fair and, you name it, the Homebrew Computer Club. And you would see the coolest guys. They used to be thought of as nerds and geeks, but suddenly they were the cool kids, the ones who knew how to code, the ones who were Steve Jobs-like in making computers. In the past couple of years, not only have I met a lot of the great scientists in the life sciences field, but I've gone to a lot of these conferences, almost like CRISPR cons, where they're young and they're hip. And it seems to me that the coolest people these days are the ones programming molecules, not ones programming microchips. I think that what you're seeing is advances in CRISPR in the past year and a half since I've written the book that involve very precise editing, where you can change letters of DNA. David Liu, a wonderful young future Nobel Prize winner at Harvard, has done prime editing and base editing that makes it so that it's not just like a word processor, but like a scalpel that you can do. Certainly using these tools for vaccines and therapies is the next new thing because of COVID. And as I said, using it in the fight against cancer.
So that very precise kind of gene editing that's going on right now, for people who haven't read the book yet, can you talk a little bit more about what that actually means?
Yeah, there's certain diseases that are very simple genetic mistakes. Sickle cell is just one letter out of the 3 billion letters of DNA we have. It flips from an A to a T or a T to an A, I can't remember, and boom, you got sickle cell. There are a lot of what we call, single gene or monogenetic or simple things, muscular dystrophy, cystic fibrosis, Huntington's. These are simple genetic diseases. So if you could go into the cells that matter and say, let me just fix it, you could cure these diseases. The next big step, which is much more controversial, is say, do it in reproductive cells. So not only are you fixing it in the patient, but if you do the eggs or the sperm or the early stage embryo, you can eliminate this from all generations subsequent and eliminate these genetic problems from the human species. Now, from your even high school study of biology, everybody knows that genes aren't usually the be all and end all determining who you are. Genes determine certain things. I mean, sickle cell is totally a genetic problem. My eye color is probably 90% genetic. My personality, my IQ, my other things are a mix of environment and genetics. So as we go down the pike, this ability to make precise edits in DNA is also going to have to be matched with an understanding of the complex interplay between what's genetic and what's environmental in making us who we are.
So what reassures you that societies will be able to manage these new biomedical opportunities that are becoming available to us? I mean, in the book, you talk about the fact that one of the scientists in China sort of jumped ahead, and there were a pair of twins who were born who had some gene editing, and the scientific community was very upset by that. And given a lot of things that are going on in this country now, and the polarization of society, and the fact that there's a very strong sort of anti-scientific thread in this country right now, in a lot of conversations, what reassures you that we're going to be able to do this?
Well, I try to help make this happen, as should you and everybody else listening, which is, in order for this to work, we're going to have to not say, oh, I never understand science. We're going to have to say, hey, science is kind of easy and cool and beautiful. And so I wrote this book so people could understand, here's the debate, but even here's the underlying science. It's not that hard. Take 10 minutes, it's a narrative thriller about Jennifer figuring this out. So I think, to the extent that more and more people have more and more understanding of the science, this will help society figure out where it wants to go. We're at a very lucky period in two ways. One is we know exactly what these tools can do, but they're still not been unleashed yet, because it's hard to actually get into a body and do stem cells or early stage embryo. I mean, this is not something that the average doctor can even do at a hospital. So we have 5, 10, 15 years before this will become so easy to do. And secondly, to get to your question about politics, almost everything in our society has become partisan and polarized to a ridiculous extent. Whether it's wearing masks, getting vaccines, believing in climate change, whatever it may be, we've all become polarized on it. Well, we haven't yet become polarized about the question of gene editing, about the question of using biotechnology to help fight certain diseases, about putting limits on biotechnology in certain ways. It has not become an issue in which the left has one position and the right has one position. So before that happens, it'd be useful for us to have the conversation, for us to understand it, and try to get ahead of the fact that we polarize everything in our society today. Let's grab onto this thing where so many people in the Senate, so many people, Republicans as well as Democrats, are working together to figure this out. So I think perhaps we have an opportunity to think this through as a society and as a world without it becoming polarized.
So I found Jennifer Doudna a very compelling character. Tell us what she thinks about the book and the way she emerges.
She's such a delightful person, and we've spent a lot of time together after the book came out as well. We've been to a couple of writers' conferences together and even spent a weekend retreat together. I think that she's a humble person. She said it was kind of weird seeing her picture on the cover of a book. She wasn't used to being famous, but all within the course of 1 year, she went from being totally unknown to having a biography like this come out, having the Nobel Prize be awarded to her, and having some of her science be used in the fight against COVID. And I don't think it's changed her very much at all. She still has that basic humility, a deep decency to her. And I think they might be making a movie of the book. And if somebody really famous plays her on the screen, I think she'll still be able to keep her humility, although that'll be a bigger test than having my book come out.
Well, she's an amazing character and an amazing woman scientist. I see that we have our first question from the audience, and I'm going to read it. The pharmaceutical industry is subject to the precautionary principle. In other words, before a drug can be marketed and sold to the public, it must be proved that it is both beneficial and that its side effects are outweighed by its benefits. Has this been the case with CRISPR or with some of the applications of CRISPR? That's the question.
Yes, very much so. Good, very good question. Same group that regulates pharmaceuticals regulates CRISPR. That's the Food and Drug Administration. So the FDA has given approval to the use of CRISPR, for example, to treat and cure sickle cell anemia, as I said, happened in the past year. They've also done things with certain congenital blindness, and they've approved clinical trials on cancer treatment. And around the world, even in China, there's a pretty much of a consensus on how we're going to regulate this. So I actually think the system is not so bad. Everybody's usually up in arms about it goes too slow, it goes too fast. I think I'm impressed with the FDA in terms of its understanding of this technology and its willingness to allow clinical trials and soon, I assume, CRISPR therapeutics to come into the marketplace.
That's exciting. So the next question from the audience is a little bit different. Thank you for this great book. I'm sure after it was published, you've heard from many folks about how it affected them. Were any of these interactions particularly moving for you?
Yes. I've had something, gut-wrenching is what happened, because I thought I was going to get a lot of pushback of, why are we moving so fast? Aren't we creating Frankenstein's monsters and Frankenfood by doing this gene editing? And instead, I get emails almost every day. One this morning, I could pull out my phone and show you, in which somebody says something along the lines of, my daughter, here's a picture of her. She's got cystic fibrosis. They say that she only has this long to live. She can no longer walk. Or here's my grandson. There'll be a towhead blonde kid in the swimming pool saying he's got this rare genetic sequence. Can you put me in touch with Jennifer Doudna? I don't want him to die. And those things are the ones that make me realize this science is something we want to make sure continues to advance.
So here's another one from the audience. What are you working on now? What's your next book? And can you tell us how you choose a topic for a book?
Yeah, I choose a topic not based on people who are smart, because smart people are a dime a dozen. They don't usually amount to much. I try to pick people who are creative and innovative and think different, as Steve Jobs would say. That's where you get to Jennifer Doudna, who thought out of the box. While everybody's focusing on DNA, she's focusing on RNA and how it can be used as a tool. And she's the one who figures out, okay, how can we isolate the components of this gene editing tool? Steve Jobs was that way, Einstein, Ben Franklin, Leonardo. They're all creative. I'm now working on a book on Elon Musk because I think that he goes down and drills down directly to the science and the physics, whether it's rocketry or batteries or cars or solar, that are the most important technologies of our future, along with the life sciences. And that is not somebody going to a dorm room and creating a social network, or something. This is tough stuff, figuring out how to make a next generation of batteries, figuring out how to make a Merlin engine that can actually, or a Raptor engine that can actually get a Starship that'll someday take us to Mars. And that ability to combine basic beliefs in science with an innovative, creative mindset is something I think we need to celebrate in our society. And I'm going to do it through Elon Musk. And I've got many other people like him, that hope someday to be able to write about.
That's great. And I hope that more of them will be women, because I think it's really important that young women, when they find that book about Codebreaker on their bed, that they see Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuelle Charpentier and they think, I want to do that too. So I think
particularly as I go into things like space travel and for that matter, vehicles, cars, it's been, for many reasons, for decades, sort of a boys' thing. And I think it's particularly good women are becoming astronauts. I think it's particularly good women are becoming material scientists. SpaceX, the company that Elon Musk founded, is run by an incredible woman engineer, Gwen Shotwell. So I've always, and even when I look at the digital revolution, I wrote a book called The Innovators that starts and ends with Ada Lovelace, who is should be far more famous than she is, because she really helped define the era of computers.
Well, and somebody has asked, who is your next woman to write about? I don't know if you've decided that yet, but.
Well, I only do one step at a time, and I'm just beginning on Elon Musk. But there are certain women in history who I like to go back and forth sometimes between contemporary figures and historical ones. When it comes to women scientists, I think Marie Curie is very obvious, but you go beyond the obvious and somebody wins the Nobel Prize both in physics and in chemistry and truly understands the fundamental connection between chemistry and physics. I'd someday like to write about her.
Sounds wonderful. So back to, let's see, we've got a number of questions coming in. How do we make sure that this technology is available to everyone, not just those who can afford to make their children smarter or faster rather than healthier?
That's a policy question. And that's why one of the reasons I write the book is that's up to you and to me and to the rest of us. Just like we can make healthcare or we can make anything more available or less available. It just depends on our will as both a society and as a nation. I do think, and I try to explain, that one of the great dangers would be is if we allow the enhancement genetically of children in an inheritable way to be done simply as a genetic supermarket where people can buy what they want if they're rich enough. That would lead to a dystopian society that people from Aldous Huxley or many others for the past 100 years have written about how bad that could be.
So here's another interesting question. How would someone with sickle cell find one of these clinical trials?
It's a good question, and it's not that hard to find clinical trials. When I did it, I went to my computer and I said, clinical trial COVID vaccine. And boom, they pop up. There's a national register, the National Institutes of Health have it. I don't particularly have on the top of my head who's doing sickle cell at the moment, although this was a hospital in Memphis that was doing it. But the good thing about our information age is if you want to find a clinical trial, an internet search engine will help you do it within 5 minutes.
Great, thank you. Here's another question. What's to prevent gene editing from being applied to creating an improved bioweapon? Do you have any information to suggest this might already be happening?
Yes, and yes. I mean, and for that matter, the coronavirus that causes COVID-19, you know, like most scientists, I think it's most likely that it was natural. But like any open-minded scientist, I think, okay, that Wuhan lab, it was doing gain-of-function experiments. It could have been a mistake, could have been even intentional, not that it was intentionally done to create a pandemic, but intentionally create a stronger virus. The biggest funder of CRISPR research in the United States is, guess who? The Pentagon, the Defense Department, using it both as potential weaponry, but mainly, or so in Jennifer's lab at least, for defensive purposes. They're creating things like anti-CRISPR, so that if somebody creates a genetically modified organism that becomes a weapon, we could see if we could, you know, counter that weapon. So I do think that bioterrorism and biowar are now replacing cyber terrorism and cyber war as the way we're going to fight in the future. And it would not be hard for a malevolent terrorist or rogue nation or enemy nation to engineer viruses or edited organisms that could be dangerous.
Well, on that note, I want
Not
to
a happy note.
On that happy note, I want to thank you for spending time with us in this very first session of the Charleston Literary Festival. And as we end, I would like to remind our audience to purchase the book Codebreaker. It's available for purchase on the Charleston Literary Festival webpage. It's an amazing read. I couldn't put it down. And I want to thank our guest again, Professor Walter Isaacson, and to everyone in the audience for sending in such great questions. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.